Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan. I'm head of Blue Stack Productions, the publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. And we're here today for another series of conversations on environmental matters. I'm very pleased to be here in Dublin with Michael Berry. Michael, you're very welcome.
Good morning, Howard. Thank you very much for coming in.
Michael, introduce yourself to the audience as to who you are and who you represent.
My name is Michael Barry. I'm working on behalf of the Irish dairy processing industry, which is one of the largest indigenous industries in Ireland and one of the very topical industries right now, because it's one of the industries that is very hungry to grow and has some very ambitious growth targets.
And before we get to the critical issue of this Harvest 2020 and the growth of the dairy industry and the implications for greenhouse gas and so forth, I thought it'd be useful to get a background on the business, because we do have a lot of visitors from not only from the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, UK, and throughout Europe, but also from the States and China. So I think it would be useful to give them just an overview. And I think we're going to concentrate today on the dairy sector. There's the agro-food sector, which is quite large. There's the agricultural sector within that, and then within the agricultural sector, there's the dairy sector. Now, what's the in terms of the processors? How many processors are there, and what types are there? Is the primary and the secondary?
In industry based on the family farm structure, we're dealing with around 18,000 family farms that are in the business of producing milk. From that, then, there are 14 dairy processors in the country, and they process that milk on a seasonal basis, because we produce milk aligned with the seasons. We're blessed with a very rainy environment in Ireland, and so most of our milk comes between February and October. So with that seasonal milk profile, we find that we have to export 85% of that milk production. And because we need to export 85% of our milk production, that then determines a lot of the products that we're making from our milk. So we're looking at a large volume of milk powders. Those milk powders are used sometimes as ingredients for consumer foods. In many cases, they're used as the base product for the manufacture of specialist nutrition, such as infant formula, sports foods, foods for special medical purposes. But also to traditional dairy products like butter and cheese. These would be very, very large products for us, important products with regards to the utilization of our milk fat. And of that product, we would sell around 40% of that would be sold into the UK market.
And where else does it go?
Just 40% of that again would be going into the remainder of the EU market, and the remainder again sold to global market. Ireland's dairy industry is built on the cooperative model. So you have a large number of cooperatives, but some of them have ceased primary processing. So they exist as farmer cooperatives. The farmers still have control of those companies, but they in turn are selling their milk pool onto another processor. So while I said earlier that we're in the mid-teens of processors, you then have a degree of specialization, whereby you would have just one lactose manufacturer in the Republic of Ireland. You'd have 4 cheese manufacturers in the Republic of Ireland. So it's become as specialized as that.
Some or all of the processors subject to the European emissions trading system?
Most of them are.
Most of them are.
Most of them are. The only person that will not be in emissions trading will be operators that will be doing liquid milk, because that's relatively low heat intensity. But as soon as somebody is running a milk dryer or an evaporator, they will be in emissions trading.
Now we come to the farmers, and you say there are 18,000 family farms. And how many farmers are working in that?
Okay, to be very clear, there's 18,000 dairy farmers.
Yes. In
Ireland in total, there's around 120,000 family farms in Ireland.
What's the difference between the beef and the cows? How many? I mean, the beef and the milk cows.
Roughly the same. We're just over 1 million dairy cows, roughly 1 million beef cows in the country right now.
Okay. But there's 18,000. We're talking about dairy farms.
Farms.
Thanks for clarifying.
Dairy farms.
And how many farmers working in those 18,000 farms?
The simplest way to look at that is take it that you have one family per farm.
Okay.
At this stage, it is only very exceptional that we're seeing more than one family being sustained
Okay.
on that farm.
So it's 18,000 families.
You can take it as 18,000
Right,
farms.
right.
That's our system. That's
Right,
our
sure.
system that when you go to an Irish farm,
Uh-huh.
it really is the family's. It is the family's operation. It is the family's business.
And what's the typical size of the farm? I mean, they typically tend to be small compared to Europe in many ways, right?
It is. It is.
The dairy farms.
Averages tend to be a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
But in general, you can take it that your standard dairy farm in Ireland could be characterised by 65 dairy cows.
Uh-huh.
That number is growing.
Now, what's the size of the land size of the farms typically? Again, I know it's varies, but
Without getting into the technicalities,
Uh-huh.
the very quick benchmark is 1 acre per 1 cow.
uh-huh.
So for a lot of dairy farms, we're looking at around 100 acres, 120
Right.
acres. And that gives them room for their dairy enterprise,
Mhm.
the replacements, and traditionally a lot of our dairy farmers would have retained beef animals. So
Mhm.
they'd have retained the male animals from the dairy herd, and that would have built up their numbers. Or they may have used some of that land to grow some corn, which they would use for feeding.
And what's the larger size farms? I mean, are there some fairly big farms that are not family farms?
What's been happening is that for a number of reasons, we are starting to see 120 cow herds becoming more and more common in the
Mhm.
country. We have exceptional occasions where you would have maybe 200 cows,
Uh-huh.
maybe 200 cows plus, but these are really exceptional in Ireland.
Mhm.
We're looking at the guy that's at the 65 cows. His ambition is to move up to 100, maybe 120.
Okay.
In most cases, if the farmer has the land,
Uh-huh.
and if he has the ability to produce that milk, and we'll talk about milk quotas in a while,
Mhm.
it's possible for one farmer to get up to managing 120 cows on his own.
Mhm.
He needs to be very efficient, he needs to be very good at what he does.
Mhm.
He needs to have the best of technology enabled on that farm.
Mhm.
But at that stage, you're probably reaching a human level at that stage. There will be exceptions, of course.
Right.
You'll have people do it. But because it's a family farm,
Right.
we've got to be cognizant that unless you get the human piece right,
Mhm.
you're not going to get the agricultural piece right.
Are there large farms, very large farms run by companies? Or are they all family?
Very, very few.
Okay.
You have
Occasionally.
you have a few legacy farms
Uh-huh.
whereby there would have been estates, and they would have been bought out by maybe individual farmers or a group of farmers that would have established the company. But the company structure of farming
Mhm.
that one would see in other economies
Mhm.
is very uncommon in Ireland.
Okay.
These are family farms.
Okay.
And one of the reasons why is that Irish people have we've a fixation with owning our land,
Right.
and so the land ownership becomes a huge factor.
Right.
The leasing of land for dairy enterprises is not as common as it is in other countries.
I've heard you talk about this many, many times, that the grass-fed basis for the dairy farming is the critical element, characteristic of that. So tell us what that means.
We have a very moderate climate. We will get rain right throughout the year, including our summer. And we have a heavy soil. So when we have a heavy soil with a lot of rain, the best use of that land is to produce grass.
Mhm.
And we can produce a lot of grass right throughout the year. And so it's on that system then that we're producing our grass.
Mhm.
So what we have is the more developed farming systems right now is a model whereby every day cows get a new allocation of grass,
Mhm.
and every 21 or 23 days they're back into the same field again because it's recovered again.
Mhm.
So it's this high efficiency of grass production, and it's a rotation system that's quite natural.
Mhm.
And that's the secret of Ireland's production.
Mhm.
Because of it, when you're dealing with a natural diet,
Mhm.
when the weather is particularly wet,
Mhm.
our dry matter intake of our animals tends not to be as high as it would be if you didn't have a diet as open to the vagaries of nature.
Mhm.
So therefore you'll see milk will tend to fluctuate.
Mhm.
So sometimes your milk will come back, and because of it, when you look at the yield of Irish dairy farms,
Mhm.
their yield per animal is lower than the yield of more intensive units. Say like our Danish colleagues would tend to be would produce more milk per animal because they've got an intensive system, they have a controlled diet. We're feeding grass. It's a low cost, it's a very efficient, it's a very sustainable diet, but it does mean that your production will move. It will move up when it's getting dry, it'll move down when it's getting very, very wet.
But in 25 years ago, there would be very little fertilizer being added to the grass, right? 50 years ago?
I would say,
Other than the cow manure, I mean, but artificial chemical fertilizers.
there would have been some being used. There would have been some.
But a huge increase in the last 25 years.
Interestingly, I would say fertilizer usage on the land would have reached the peak maybe 10, 12 years ago.
Okay.
And now it's falling.
Okay.
It's falling because of a couple of factors. One, fertilizer is a big cost.
Right.
And secondly, people have started measuring their soil. So soil testing has become the norm. And people are more focused now on applying appropriate levels of fertilizer to their soil. And of course, the great thing of that is that it means that while we're doing this to optimize our profitability, optimize the yield from our land, it also means the issues of runoff to our rivers and lakes is minimized.
What is the major impact on the greenhouse gas emissions? I mean, was it 28% of Ireland's greenhouse gases are from farming? From the whole agriculture sector, not just...
Yeah, if we look
dairy.
at methane and nitrous oxide are two of the big factors for us. The more animals you have, the more methane you have. So in the context of where all EU member states, the 27 EU member states, are now bound to legally binding targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we must reduce those emissions by 20% by the year 2020. That's a real problem. That's a real challenge because the easiest thing in the world would be to adopt a policy whereby we would reduce our cow numbers by 20%. Now, the debate in Ireland is that we've yet to decide which element of our sector, which parts of society should carry the greatest reduction coefficient. But we're trying to assess what's the best and the most efficient way to address those targets to agriculture. There's a policy conflict between an enabling policy to allow production to increase in Europe, because Europe had a limit on dairy production through its milk quota system. That will expire in 2015.
Why was that quota imposed? It was 84, right? Why
It was 84.
Why was the quota imposed in the first place?
Is both Europe and the United States adopted very similar strategies. Their strategies were to put in place a policy that would give good prices for agricultural produce that would allow their indigenous agricultural industries to develop to such a degree whereby the question of food security fell off the table. It was no longer a concern within the United States, it was no longer a concern within Europe. That was what was behind it. So what they did, they created an artificial price. So you had a US price, you had a European price, and that price was higher than the global market. It was done so by subsidies. But to control the budget that was set aside to subsidize the industry, they put a quota. They say, well, we're going to subsidize this amount, but no more.
No more, right.
And so they adopted this quota. They said, that's it. And anything more you produce, we're going to penalize you because you're going to oversupply what we consider to be what the world's demand can take. And that's the legacy of quotas.
And that goes in 2015.
In 2015, the milk quota system expires. And there will not be any more quotas beyond that time. And that is matched to a similar change in the CAP, in Europe's Common Agricultural Policy. And that Common Agricultural Policy is that it no longer wants to be intervening in the price or in the market for food produce. And so when it's no longer doing that in terms of subsidization, it no longer makes sense to have a milk quota or a reduction or a restriction of production.
How was the industry addressing the methane emissions over the last 10 years to reduce them? Because there is that pressure to get 20% reduction, and farming is one of the big contributors to that. What were the methods of trying to get that down, to reduce from the dairy cows?
In Europe, most of the focus on greenhouse gas control has been through the emissions trading scheme
Right.
at industry level.
Right.
There have been initiatives such as, which have been more about awareness in terms of the application of carbon taxes, but putting reduction levels and limits and initiatives to reduce and address methane or the emissions from the transport sector, it's only now that this is really going beyond the emissions trading scheme.
You've done a very good job of showing us the landscape that exists with it. Now that's about to change dramatically. At the very same time where the EU is now imposing on the non-ETS system these requirements, which would include, again, the agricultural sector and the dairy industry. The caps are going, the quota is being lifted in 2015, and there are plans now for a 50% increase in dairy production starting in 2015, correct?
Yeah, when it became apparent that the quota system would not be renewed, there was some very good work done, whereby the industry, all the stakeholders in the industry, looked at where would the industry go, where could the industry go, for two reasons. One, we were seeing the first time in almost 30 years that we would no longer have production limits on milk in Ireland. And at the same time, we were looking at a virtually unprotected market, whereby we were going to see price fluctuation, price volatility, and price movement that would really challenge the economic sustainability of a lot of family farms. So the two things go together. So in looking at that, the feeling was that for a lot of farms to respond to that, they had to embrace the opportunity to expand. And in most cases, they were looking at where did the relative profitability of enterprises lie. And milk production at farm level in Ireland is the single most profitable enterprise. So when we went and we looked at what was the potential at farm level, it was fairly evident that there was huge opportunities to increase milk production at farm level. How? In many cases, I said to you at the start of this interview that a lot of family farms would have had a beef operation plus a dairy operation. So what people started to identify was that it was possible to increase milk by removing the beef animals from the herd and replacing those with dairy animals. And a lot of our expansion is coming from that. The other thing is that we're probably and have been carrying too many animals, because as our efficiency and our effectiveness of managing our grassland and as our genetic base improved, a lot of people retained the same cow numbers. But they had to break on them. We had this quota effect. So the people were artificially slowing those animals back. So there's a natural opportunity to get more milk, even on a grass-based system, from those existing cows, plus replacing beef animals with dairy animals on those farms.
Is there
That's the basis of our expansion aspirations. Now, I would have to say, Harvest 2020 says there's a potential for milk production to increase by up to 50% by 2020. The market price will determine everything. So if global demand slows down, for instance, for dairy products, we're not going to increase because there's not going to be buyers there.
Right. You suggested that the expansion, if it occurs, now again the pricing is going to determine everything basically, and the more supply that's out there, it may drop the price even more. With this, the quotas off, if there's going to be more supply, that might affect the lowering the price.
I think what's likely to happen in a European context is a migration of production. The most studies and most analysis would suggest a movement in milk production away from Southern Europe and in towards Northern Europe. So in terms of Europe's overall milk production is not going to go anywhere near a 50% increase. In fact, European milk production may actually stay static, but you may see a lot more milk coming from places like Ireland, northern France, which also enjoys a very good sustainable climate for grass growing as well. And that's where a lot of the milk migration will come from. So what you could see is a movement of production.
Okay. Why are they moving to the south? too expensive?
It's expensive in the south
because
and there's challenges in the south. In the southern Europe, they don't have grass. In many cases, they've got to. They're dependent on expensive feeding systems.
Okay.
They've got water problems.
Right.
In parts of southern Europe, they use water not alone just to drink, but they're using them to cool cows.
Sure. You suggest, I think, and elsewhere I've heard you talk that the 50% production, as it unfolds, and it may take some time to do that over for a while, it's going to lead probably to a consolidation in the processing business in terms of there'll be fewer but larger.
Yes.
And also the same thing with farms, that there will be fewer but larger farms. In how few and how large are the farms going to be, you think?
The sense that we have is that the 150 cow herd will become a lot more common.
Okay.
We don't envisage factory farms. One of the reasons being the land ownership. One of the biggest challenges actually to expansion in Ireland is going to be the question of land, the question of land ownership.
And land availability, yeah.
Land availability.
Yeah.
So land tends not to be mobile. People tend to hold on to it for generation after generation. And it's for that reason that we would tend to take the view in the industry that the development of US-style factory farms will very much be the exception.
Okay.
Very much the exception.
Do you anticipate some of the smaller family farms will just disappear? They won't be able to survive the pressures?
Yeah, I think they will.
Any sense of the size of that diminishing of that family farm?
We're still thinking that our total dairy farm numbers will be close to 14,000. That's where a lot of our thoughts are right now.
But they'd be large.
But that is starting to get us into the 100, 150 cow herds.
Now, Michael, comes to the critical question for the conversation. That is, you have 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland generated by the agricultural sector, not just dairy, but the total. And you now have at least the theoretical possibility of a 50% increase with the milk quota leaving. What does that do to the greenhouse gas emissions targets of reducing by 20%? And the 20% is below 1990 levels, correct?
Let's get to the chase.
Okay.
We're going to produce more greenhouse gas emissions because we'll have more cows.
How much
more?
More
Cows mean more methane.
How much more?
The discussion on this, and this is important, one of the things that has become evident is that greater efficiency at farm level will mean less emissions per litre of milk, which is the right way to address this challenge. So this means if we can get more milk per animal without having to bring in more artificial feeds, greater and more efficient and targeted use of fertilizers at farm level, greater and more efficient use of energy on farm. And when I say energy, I'm talking not alone about the electrical energy for milking the animals, I'm talking about the tractors and all of the functions that need to be there. Less human intervention is what we need to go for. Is that going to be sufficient in itself to offset more cows in the country? It's not.
Right.
It's not. And I think that it's important that we move beyond is it possible that we could get more emissions from Irish dairying if it expands? We will.
Right.
We are going to get it. The world needs more food. The world demand is growing by 2% per annum. We need to get food out there. And there are countries where food is grown naturally. And Ireland is one of these countries. So Ireland can increase its production. Problem is, of course, Ireland will breach its national reduction targets if it aims to do this.
Right.
And then, if you draw the parallel that from the 1st of January next year, all of my dairy processing plants will participate in a European emissions trading scheme. It doesn't seem logical that our supply base exists within a national limitation. And especially if we were going to see the migration of production from Southern Europe into Northern Europe, it would seem a lot more logical that Europe addresses a European target to reduce emissions. And therefore, as milk production is displaced from Southern Europe into Northern Europe, when you look at it in a European context, Europe's emissions will fall. That, to me, would seem entirely logical. Right now, we're in the process of running out a sustainability audit across all dairy farmers in Ireland. And we're sending people in looking at what are the relevant factors to emissions reduction, and trying to bring those farmers up to speed and make sure that they're changing their habits, changing their behaviour, so that their emissions per unit production reduces.
If the farming sector cannot, make its contribution to that, where does that? Either you change the 20% target, right, from the EU, who might be a little reluctant to do that, with other countries saying why should we reduce, or it has to come from some other sector, right?
Ireland has yet to decide. Ireland, as a country, must reduce its total emissions by 20% by 2020. It hasn't yet agreed what sector should carry what proportion of that load. Discussion about an absolute reduction leads us only to one thing, and that is, do you want to reduce food production in countries that could produce food more naturally? And I think that for those that would suggest we should do so, need to consider what are the consequences of their actions.
I think you've been very direct and honest that this is a huge challenge, and it's not solved. It's not solved yet. Even the unit production efficiency is not going to solve the hard target number of 20%, and that's very forthcoming of you. I think that's very helpful.
What's great is that we've gone beyond this phase of where people are saying, I don't want to participate in this, or I want a derogation, or I want an exemption. No. People are in and they're saying, right, we're going to do something here. And people now have got to the stage whereby they're prepared to stand up and say, like I did earlier, and said, you are going to have more emissions. It doesn't mean you're going to step out of the game.
Right.
But that is a huge change, and that's a societal change. And I think it's when that has happened that we're going to start to see some real improvements.
It's an optimistic note to end on, and especially since I have to go back to New York on Sunday, where it's not going to be so optimistic. I actually will carry. Mike, thank you for talking with us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.